So I talk a lot about the trauma of being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. And a lot of people are interested in that concept and want to hear more about what I mean by that. So just to back up a tiny bit, as many of you who are my followers know, I have been fairly critical of Dr. Dodson's concept of rejection sensitive dysphoria, which he claims is an innate genetic neurological condition that is part of being ADHD. That we are, those of us who are ADHD are genetically and neurologically wired with this disorder, this defect that makes us acutely sensitive to rejection and other sort of, emotional dysregulation. My argument with Dr. Dodson is not that ADHD people, and often autistic people as well, aren't emotionally dysregulated. I think that often we are. But I have yet to see anybody offer any sort of scientific evidence that there's anything innate in our neurology or in our genes that makes us especially dysphoric. And my argument is that actually what he describes as rejection sensitive dysphoria looks an awful lot like the symptoms of somebody who has experienced complex trauma. So that's my argument in a nutshell. Again, just to be really clear, I am not in any way discounting anyone's experience of feeling hypersensitive and reactive to people's rejection. I completely 100% believe that that is a true experience. In fact, I myself have been, for most of my adult life, highly emotionally dysregulated and reactive. But I really do think that those experiences, our emotional reactivity, which looks just like complex trauma does, is not something that is baked into who we are, and is not, more importantly, what Dr. Dodson argues is that it's untreatable. It's untreatable through psychotherapy. It's untreatable through anything other than 2 medications that he has found effective in his patients. And while, again, I am also completely not opposed to medication, medication has saved my own life. So believe me, I'm not opposed to medication. But I just reject that the only way that we can get on top of our emotional dysregulation, our emotional sensitivity, our reactivity is through medication, because I believe that just in the ways that trauma can be healed, so can we. So that's sort of a long-winded wind-up to this topic of what exactly do I mean when I'm talking about trauma. A lot of people, when they first hear my argument, say, oh, but I've had this sensitivity to rejection way before I ever had anything traumatic happen to me. Maybe I had some bad things happen to me, but nothing like what people who really have trauma go through. And so that's what I want to address today. What it is that I mean when I'm talking about the trauma of being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. I think that the trauma of being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world is something that we basically, start to experience from the get-go, from like our first breath. It's like the air we breathe. So of course, it's not any surprise that we don't really recognize it as trauma, and we don't recognize it as being a cause of our emotional reactivity and emotional dysregulation. It's like, the expression that a fish doesn't know that it's wet. That's sort of how I think trauma is for many of us. That from the moment that we are fussy, sensitive, acutely aware and curious little tiny babies, we're already being treated differently. We're being treated as excessive and as too much, and as and in some situations, unfortunately, we're being treated as manipulative and bad. You hear it. I don't know if any of you have children. I have 2 children. If and when you do have children, you will know that People are obsessed with children sleeping through the night. And among the first questions that they ask you is she sleeping through the night yet? And with my daughter, who was our first child, she did actually sleep through the night for like most of her first year, which is really unusual. And people would say, oh, she's such a good baby. Both of my kids, by the way, are neurodivergent, but in really different ways. My son, on the other hand, was like so intense. I could never put him down. He never slept through the night. He basically slept with me all the time, just like belly to belly. It was the only way he could sleep. And, people would say things like, when are you going to put that child down? Why are you spoiling him? That's how we talk about babies from like literally the time that they're like 6 weeks old. People start obsessing with, can you put the baby down? Is the baby happy in a swing? Does the baby sleep through the night? So this stuff starts really, really early. The ways that we are perceived and the ways that our parents and all of the people around us interact with us. And of course, nobody is trying to traumatize their child. And of course, if you have a child who never sleeps and never lets you put them down, that can be really stressful for the parent. So it makes sense that there can be like some stress and tension around all of that. But I really do believe that that stuff starts so early and then it just continues, like with my son. He had a hard time going to preschool and he had a hard time, he was very sensitive to textures and being messy, and there was food he didn't like to eat. And, thank goodness, at least in preschool, he had preschool teachers who really understood him and cared for him. But by the time he got to elementary school, it was awful. He was so unhappy. He was so miserable. He, was so anxious. He hated school so deeply. I'm not excusing when I say that neurodivergent children are born into trauma and are traumatized pretty much from like the get-go. I'm not in any way excusing myself as a parent. Um, I'm still kind of dealing with a lot of the fallout of the mistakes I made as a parent who was herself neurodivergent. I mean, I didn't have diagnoses back then, and I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust my instincts. I didn't. In some ways I did, but in a lot of ways I didn't, especially around school. I just thought that what you had to do is send your kid to school and that you had to figure it out. Like that was the only option it wasn't the only option in my mind, but I was married to someone who wouldn't even consider the possibility of homeschooling. So we sent him to school and he was miserable and he was traumatized, and he continued to be traumatized through a lot of his school life until I finally did pull him out when he was a freshman in high school, and things have gotten a lot better since then. But this is the point. My son is a child who had a neurodivergent parent, had a neurodivergent sister, had enormous amounts of love and acceptance, and who was held and cared for and given a lot of privilege and given a lot of latitude and freedom, and is still, I think, traumatized by many of his early childhood experiences, and we're still dealing with that. So imagine a child in a less open and a less accommodating family. Of course, those early experiences are going to be really traumatic. I think that neurodivergent kids are criticized, they're bullied at school, viewed as other, viewed as quirky, viewed as overly sensitive, dismissed, not taken seriously. Like all of those things cumulatively create a trauma that is akin to a kind of abandonment or a kind of rejection by our families, our schools, and eventually our employers, by society in general. We're told that we're disordered. We're treated like we're disordered, where the only solution is for us to fit in better into the society as opposed to the society accommodating us and allowing us to just be. And I think that that is powerfully and fundamentally traumatizing.